Hey, welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. This is yet again Osmussen speaking. This is actually my first ever video blog, and I'm going to start out by covering the topic of hypnosis hijacking. So, a Facebook friend recently asked me the question, how do you do hypnosis hijacking? Now, this is a concept that I've written about quite extensively in my first book, Provocative Hypnosis. I want to get clear on the terms to begin with. Milton Erickson used to say that a client can be in a deep trance and a light trance at the same time, meaning that the client might be completely experientially absorbed into some experience, but that experience might not necessarily include you. So the question of relevance here is when a client accesses what you could call a symptomatic trance, meaning that he suddenly goes into his symptom state, gets highly absorbed into that symptom state, and it happens automatically, does that experience include you? Do you still have rapport with the person? Is the person still responsive to what you're doing? If you are part of that experience, then you can help the client update and change that symptomatic trance into something more useful, or even help them see that it's a psychological illusion to begin with, depending a bit upon which type of framework that you're operating out of. If you're not part of the experience, then most people have a tendency to attempt to calm the client down or ensure the client in some way, and then later perhaps attempt to go back and work on the symptomatic trance. But there's actually a way to include yourself into the trance. And when you do that, as I said, you have the chance to help the person update it. So there's a very simple test that you can do to determine whether you are part of the client's symptomatic trance or not. So here's the client. The client spontaneously goes into his phobic response, for example, his fear response. When that happens, if you say, "That's right," and as that feeling increases now, if you see the person automatically respond to that, and almost look a little bit surprised and bewildered when it's happening, then you are part of the experience. And then you can directly go into whatever type of work that you do. If you, on the other hand, use that suggestion that I just mentioned, and you can see that the client is not really responding, then that means that you're not part of the symptomatic trance. So in that case, it becomes a case of some basic pacing and leading. You get the person to start voluntarily doing some stuff, following your instructions, and then you include yourself into the experience. So if you're doing regression work, for example, it might be to say to the person, "Okay, Jeff, look at me. Look at me here. As you look at me here, place your hand on top of mine. Keep focusing on my forehead right here as you listen to my voice. Start pressing down. For each number that I count, increase the pressure." Now, as long as the person's following this, you may then do the hand drop and then suggest that as you count from 1 to 5, the feeling will get stronger. If you do this, now you're suddenly part of the experience, and you've kind of hijacked it, and you can help the client update it in a way that it's useful. So this is the reason for learning how to do this is because sometimes in the office when people come in, they might spontaneously go into their symptomatic trance. And very often they're ready to work with it right off the bat. So instead of having to do a lot of other stuff first, you can just immediately begin to do the work if you know how to include yourself in it. The other really useful application for this is if you're doing real-life testing. So let's say that you have a client, for example, who has a fear of heights. and you take the client to a height to actually test the work. Now, let's say that the client actually gets fearful and kind of goes into their symptomatic trance again. Now, instead of doing a lot of exposure therapy or bringing the client back to the office to do more hypnosis work, you can do hypnosis work right then and there. So what you can do is you can say to the person, okay, take a step back and another step and another step, and keep doing it, but make sure that the person still has some access to the fear response. This is something that the person can voluntarily do. So you're starting out by asking the person to step back, which he wants to do anyways, but he's doing it as a response to your instructions. Then you can ask the person to put his hand on top of yours and do a basic hand drop induction, and then take over the fear response in a sense. Include yourself into the experience. Now you might do a live regression right then and there. I've done this at sites for heights. I've done it at hotels near elevators, and I've also done it in pet stores, and it's worked beautifully. A final point here is that you want to get good at distinguishing between a symptomatic trance that's spontaneous and what I like to call a pity cry or a distractor. So a symptomatic trance is when a person spontaneously goes into their symptom state and it feels as if it's completely involuntary. So you'll often see a kind of bewildered look on their face, or a micro expression or facial expression of surprise, or a kind of a straightening of the spine, or the facial expressions of fear. You'll very often see this. This is a sign that it's happening non-voluntarily. So it's a symptomatic trance experience. If the person uses a distractor, it's a lot more voluntary. So they might look at you, make sure that they have eye contact with you, and then look down and start sobbing, for example. This is usually a distractor. It's usually what I would call a pity cry. Or if they do pretend anger by slamming their fist on the table first and kind of acting angry, versus first kind of showing the facial expressions and then doing it. The latter is likely a non-voluntary response. The first one is more likely a more conscious, deliberate, I'm going to pretend to be angry type of response. So you want to get good at distinguishing between those. I had a client many years ago who a friend of mine brought in who claimed to be very scared around spiders. And after talking to her on the phone, I had some suspicions that something a bit fishy was going on. So when she came into my office, I very congruently told her, look, I have something for you here. I kind of gestured that I was going to show her a spider. And she didn't even flinch. And when we talked about spiders and I had her, imagine spiders, didn't really do anything, which kind of confirmed my hunch that this wasn't quite what she made it up to be. It turned out it was about boundaries, and one of the tricks of the trade that she had to kind of attempt to control her boyfriend. So I knew I would have to mess with her boundaries a little bit. So I said something to her that kind of challenged her manipulation tactics and held her accountable for how she was acting. And she looked at me, and then she looked down and kind of started sobbing. And I knew that this was a distractor. So I kind of leaned back in my seat and I said, you know what? It doesn't really impress me that much. Immediately, she looked at me and she started raging. How the fuck do you dare treat me that way? Blah, 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 blah. Rage response. So I kind of looked back again and I said, nah, that doesn't really do it either. And then she leaned back and just said, okay. Then I said, now, let's go check out some spiders. And I walked over to her and started guiding her out towards the door. And here came the spontaneous, non-voluntary fear response. And when it did, I said to her, and as that feeling gets stronger now, she responded, and we resolved it right then and there. So these are some useful distinctions that you can experiment with in your NLP or hypnotherapy or coaching practice. If you want to read more about hypnosis hijacking, you can check out my first book, Provocative Hypnosis. And if you have any questions around hypnosis, psychology, the 3 principles, neurolinguistic programming that you'd like me to cover, send me an email at provocativehypnosis.com. Thanks.